Pornography cleared the Senate Tuesday. Senator Heather Cloud's bill prohibits using a child's image to train artificial intelligence to produce child sexual abuse materials. She says AI systems are now capable of generating extremely realistic images that appear to depict children, even if that child doesn't actually exist. Cloud's bill is modeled after laws in Texas and South Carolina. The bill passed unanimously in the Senate and will head to a House committee. A bill to fraudulently represent military service in Louisiana cleared the Senate yesterday. Port Allen Senator Caleb Kleinpeter says there's also a federal law against falsifying military service, but it's hardly ever enforced.
We all support our military, we support our veterans, and nobody should be falsely advertising that they have been in the military or served in a capacity.
The penalty can be up to 5 years in prison and or a fine of up to $10,000. The bill now heads to a House committee. The majority of voters are still undecided in the U.S. Senate Republican primary, according to a poll candidate Julia Letlow commissioned. ULM political expert Pearson Cross says though Letlow's poll shows her leading incumbent Bill Cassidy by 1%, the race could still go either way.
Letlow hasn't put it away, but also Cassidy's campaign hasn't put Letlow away yet either.
The survey conducted by Fabrizio Lee and Associates has Letlow at 27%, Cassidy at 26%, Fleming at 19%, and 28% undecided. The Senate Republican primary is May 16th. With Louisiana News, I'm Diane Mack.
Support for NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include United States Postal Service, dedicated to putting reliability at the core of USPS Ground Advantage to help businesses operate smoothly. More at usps.com/Ground Advantage.
Support comes from Tulane School of Social Work, featuring a DSW program where students can conduct research to inform their practice and educate others through writing peer-reviewed publications. Online, 1 weekend a month. Application deadline is May 10th to start this fall. socialwork.tulane.edu.
Support comes from Access Strength, a by-appointment-only one-on-one personal training studio at 3601 Chapatulas Street. Strength and resistance training performed on medically designed weight machines based in peer-reviewed science. The program takes 30 minutes a week. Information and appointments at accessstrength.com. Support comes from The Occasional Wife, with 6 estate sale stores featuring home goods consignment and retail in the New Orleans area and the Gulf South. Elmwood, Magazine Street, the French Quarter, and Mandeville, with new locations in Perdido Key, Florida, and Pass Christian, Mississippi. TheOccasionalWife.com.
Welcome to Louisiana Considered. Today, I'm Adam Boss. Just ahead this Friday, LSU's Riley Center will host an event exploring the influence America's media has exerted over the political process, both historically and in the present day. Also, we'll learn about the use of immunotherapy to fight cancer at Baton Rouge's Mary Bird Perkins Cancer Center. But first, analysis from Pew shows state reserve funds, often called rainy day funds, largely fell this past year. That's the first time this happened since the Great Recession of the early 2000s. It's down from a record high for state rainy day funds nationwide just the prior year. Louisiana actually had a record high rainy day balance this year, but we can't rest easy. That record high still falls short of the national average based on Pew ratings that put reserve funds relative to spending. To learn more about how our state's rainy day fund compares and the policy decisions that affect fiscal reserves, we have with us Paige Forrest, Associate Manager of the Fiscal 50 Project at the Pew Charitable Trusts. Paige, thanks for being here today.
Hi, Adam. Thanks so much for having me.
First, we just heard a little about the national trend, and there are ways Louisiana doesn't follow the trend and ways the state might compare favorably or unfavorably. First, tell me more about what we know about state reserve funds in general and what pressures are being put on those funds lately.
That's right.
Absolutely.
That's right,
So,
Ken.
rainy day funds are accounts that states have, savings accounts that they can turn to when there is an unexpected budget gap, whether
That's
that's
right,
a
Ken.
recession or a natural disaster. Pew measures those rainy day funds in terms of number of days the state could run on them alone, because the dollar amount is going to be different for every state. It's the same way that you might think about your savings account in terms of how many months of rent or your mortgage that you need saved up. Like you mentioned up top, In fiscal year 25, state rainy day fund capacity fell for the first time since the Great Recession. This is not surprising given that budgets are starting to tighten after the years of surplus that states saw after the pandemic-induced recession. Louisiana, however, bucks that trend a little bit.
Tell me more about how Louisiana does kind of buck that trend like you mentioned. How does Louisiana compare?
So as of fiscal year 25, Louisiana could run on its rainy day fund alone for just over a month's worth of spending, or about 34 days to be precise. Now, that is below the national median of about 48 days worth of spending. However, the state has steadily increased its rainy day fund over the past 4 fiscal years, both in terms of dollar amount and in terms of strength. So for context, Louisiana's rainy day fund has grown in capacity by about 20 days since where it was before the pandemic.
So what you're telling me is important because it tells us about our rainy day fund relative to state spending. Can you tell me whether Louisiana is likely to be able to continue growing its rainy day fund?
So Louisiana has a statute in place that dictates that if there's a surplus available, 25% of that surplus is supposed to go into the budget stabilization fund. So that's what's enabled the state to keep growing its rainy day fund. However, budgets are expected to tighten across the country. So if that surplus does diminish, then Louisiana would not have that automatic statute in place that would allow it to keep growing its rainy day fund. Instead, adding more to the rainy day fund would have to be a deliberate practice.
And Louisiana is looking at some potential revenue shortfalls in the future, depending on what the state government does, for instance, with taxes. Can you tell me more about how that change in income could further impact the rainy day fund?
So for every state, Pew is a big fan of what we call budget stress testing, which means looking at a state's revenue and expenditures under multiple scenarios. Budget stress tests are typically thought about in recession contexts. So testing a state's finances in a moderate or severe recession, but could also be used to stress test new tax cuts. So if Louisiana is looking at implementing certain tax cuts, they can test and see, okay, if we see this decrease in our revenue while these tax cuts are being phased in, how much would we need to save up in order to cover that temporary shortfall? However, an important caveat to that is that rainy day funds are not meant to be a permanent replacement for lost revenue.
We're speaking with Paige Forrest of the Pew Charitable Trusts. We're talking about state rainy day funds and how Louisiana compares. When we talk politics here and when the state legislature is in session especially, we hear a lot about the state budget, the annual operating budget, what it operates from year to year, whether that's up or down. Why talk about the state rainy day fund, whether it is important in itself, separate from the budget?
The state rainy day fund is what enables Louisiana to feel secure about its spending policy. When a state is up to date on whether or not its rainy day fund has enough saved away, then they can feel confident taking those extra surplus dollars that are not being put into the rainy day fund and spent on other policy priorities like healthcare and education.
Could you tell me more about the public policy decisions that are contributing to Louisiana's rainy day fund situation?
The statute that Louisiana has in place that enables 25% of the surplus to be deposited into the rainy day fund is a great budgetary tool according to Pew's best practices. However, something to be mindful of is that as budgets continue to tighten due to federal uncertainty or potential tax cuts, that surplus might not always be present and cannot necessarily be relied upon to continue to grow the state's rainy day fund. So while those tools are certainly a best practice, they can't be the only mechanism that a state relies on to grow the rainy day funds.
Are there any model states out there, any policies that we could look up to, ones that contribute to relatively high stability there?
One important thing to consider about rainy day funds is that there is no right dollar amount. That's one of the reasons that Pew does use this day or strength model to assess rainy day funds, is because the right amount in a rainy day fund is going to look different for every state. California's budget is a lot bigger than Louisiana's, so Louisiana's rainy day fund doesn't need to be as big as California's. For instance, as of fiscal year 23, Louisiana was actually the most reliant on federal funds in the country. And so Louisiana might place a higher emphasis on uncertainty surrounding federal funding right now when looking at what's the appropriate amount for the state's rainy day fund.
Okay, so if we were looking at the 50 states and we saw your rating for the state with the most days it could operate on its rainy day fund, what you're saying is that is not necessarily a useful thing to look at.
That's correct. So if you go to Pew's website right now and you see which state has the highest capacity in its rainy day fund, you're going to see that Wyoming could run on its rainy day fund alone for over 300 days. However, that doesn't mean that every state needs to be shooting for the 300 days that Wyoming has currently saved up in their rainy day fund, or necessarily that Wyoming is doing anything wrong. Instead, there are different considerations like a state's tax revenue stream and how much that tax revenue fluctuates. So Wyoming sees more fluctuations in its tax revenue collections and therefore has more money saved up in order to prepare for potential downturns.
How does Louisiana compare to other peer states? Are there good examples of states that have similar policy and similar ways their rainy day funds are responding?
So looking to other peer states for Louisiana and other states in the South, the median capacity for states in the South is a rainy day fund of about 45 days. Louisiana does rank 12th out of the 16 states in the region. So all of those states in the South have very different economic conditions going on right now, but where Louisiana can learn and keep an eye on its peer states is looking at the economic conditions those states are facing and seeing, okay, how many of these are applicable to us, and are these tailwinds that we should also be looking out for when thinking about our rainy day fund.
Paige Forrest, Associate Manager of the Fiscal 50 Project at the Pew Charitable Trusts. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks, Adam. I appreciate it.
This is Louisiana Considered. I'm Adam Voss. Taking place Friday, LSU's Riley Center for Media and Public Affairs presents its 2026 John Burroughs Symposium. The topic, America Media at 250. They will be exploring the influence the media has exerted over civic life in America over the past 2.5 centuries as the U.S. celebrates what's generally being marked as its 250th birthday this year, and what that tells us about the landscape and how our media influences us today. To learn more about what's important to us today about the history of American journalism, a quarter of a millennium into the experiment, we have with us Michael DiResto, Director of the Riley Center at LSU. Thanks for being in the studio today.
Thanks for having me.
And a note, LSU's Riley Center is a sponsor of one of our stations, WRKF, for this event, but those sponsorship decisions are separate from our editorial decisions, and we have an intentional framework in place to ensure they don't influence one another. Okay, Michael, first, you're going to be talking about that interface between the media and politics. How will your guests connect the history of journalism and what happened in the past with what's happening today?
Great question. And first and foremost, there'll be a historical element to this program, but as you indicate, we are going to have a number of panels that are talking about what's happening today and with a glance toward what's happening in the future. We hope that with some of our historical scholars, we'll be able to see some patterns, some overlaps. You know, one thing that comes to mind, back then in the founding era, you had founders who would launch newspapers. You had Thomas Paine write Common Sense, which potentially was a podcast before its time. You had anonymous broadsides in various gazettes being funded by people in government to attack the newly formed parties. So we feel like there's crossovers. The important thing is that a lot of that freewheeling, it was a little bit of a Wild West in terms of discourse, but we survived it. And at the 250th anniversary, it's a time for us to reflect, where are we with our democracy as we look toward what comes after the 250th anniversary.
So Wild West then, and a lot of times we look at the media today, the decentralized media is another Wild West that maybe will survive again. What do you think the big takeaway will be from comparing historical press to political interactions today, especially looking at your, you have a talk that'll be a then and now.
Yeah. Well, a lot of what we do at the Riley Center, our original mission talked about how the strength of democracy, vital economic outcomes come from kind of the quality of our discourse. And the John Breaux Symposium is our signature event every year to help look at that cross-section between media and politics. There are a lot of different crossovers, especially now when a lot of our work looks at polarization. And they didn't have that word back then, but they were deeply partisan at the same time. Other parallels, too, is that when you've got such a fragmented media landscape where we are now inundated with national news, potentially squashing local news, you had Samuel Adams in Massachusetts forming committees of correspondence because he wanted the news that was happening in Massachusetts to go national so that the other 12 colonies knew what the British were doing to them. So there are some things that are different, some things that are same, but a lot of the same questions remain. One of our scholars is going to make the case based on her research that democracy works better when we've got a really good functioning local news. And that if we get drowned out by the national voices, that tends to increase our polarization.
There are some concepts we can identify from the recent zeitgeist as we talk about media. I'm thinking fake news is one of them. Maybe that term isn't used so much right now, but it sure was just a couple of years ago. What are some other concepts like that we might identify, and how do they compare to similar practices historically?
Well, just to take that one, it is interesting that two of our scholars, one who focuses on the founding era, and one of our LSU scholars, Jack Hamilton, and Jordan Taylor at the Williamsburg Foundation, he's starting to use more language like the dark arts rather than fake news, where, again, the citizens are trying to get information. The people striving for power are wanting them to see things one way, and they're using various techniques to get that message across. We think there's obvious parallels to the way the media landscape works today. And one of the things in all of our talks and in all of our promotions is we're not saying journalism because it's all media. We're in a landscape today where it's all media. And in the founding era, when we talk about freedom of the press, they had a generalized definition of the word press. It was anything that came off a printing press. It was Franklin's newspaper. It was Hamilton's pamphlets when he was 19 years old. It was the Declaration of Independence itself. So we're looking at it from the perspective of, we think now we're in a media just saturation of all these different forms. But it was a pretty exciting time back then as well.
We're talking with Michael DiResto with the Riley Center at LSU, talking about an event Friday that will draw connections between history and today, relating to how the media interfaces with democracy as America celebrates 250 years. As you mentioned, you're going to address media polarization and how maybe that's not a new thing. What can history tell us now about the role the press plays in polarization?
The press can make it worse, to be quite honest. And I think we're all familiar with that concept, whether you happen to know somebody who gets their news only from one cable news network or gets their news from a single social media source. And so when we think about polarization, they didn't use that language back then. They used faction. And even in Washington's farewell address, he talked.
What's good, my faction? What's good, my faction? There you go. That's for you. That's you. What's good, my buddy? What's good, my buddy? What's goody with you? Nope. Hey. He wants me.